Well, after being mostly absent from the spotlight since his 2007 election defeat, the former Prime Minister John Howard has re-entered the political arena in spectacular fashion.
The release of his long-awaited memoir, Lazarus Rising, has propelled the former PM and some of his colleagues back into the headlines. And John Howard joins us now from Sydney. John Howard, good morning. I'm pleased you could join us.
Thank you.
You've said before that and you say in the book that if you didn't go into politics, you might have ended up as a journalist. So how did you go about researching the subject of John Howard for this book?
Well, I relied on memory. I researched the written record. I have quite a good chronological recall of events. And because I've been immersed in politics for most of, but not all of my working life, I didn't find that part of it difficult. One of the good things about having a chronological recall of events is that it enables you to establish a framework for how you tackle an autobiography. And then I set about researching, looking at old statements, looking at old press reports, reading academic work. It was a long job. I had a good research assistant. And I found it very enjoyable. I liked it. I liked it a lot. It was hard work. You have to keep applying yourself, but I managed to do that, and I'm very happy with the outcome. I hope the consuming public is equally happy.
There's been much...
And so does my publisher.
Yeah, well, your publisher will be banking on that one.
Yes.
There's been much comment made in the press recently about Iraq and the waterfront, and you cover all that in your book. Less discussed is your view, which I found very interesting in the book, that there was no more important piece of social legislation debated in the time that I was in the Federal Parliament than the Family Law Bill. And you go on to say that it can be argued that this piece of law has weakened marriage as a bedrock institution in Australia. Do you wish that no-fault divorce had not become law in Australia?
No, I didn't argue that at all. If you've read this chapter carefully, I was very strongly in favour of getting rid of no-fault divorce, in bringing in no-fault divorce. I practised a bit of divorce law before I entered Parliament. I thought the old system was undignified. I thought those terrible divorce raids and the like were awful and quite distasteful, and I was very much in favour of accepting the view that if a marriage is clearly broken down, no real purpose is served by keeping it on foot, provided proper arrangements are going to be made for children and for their care and upbringing. The point of disagreement, I guess, was the period of separation. The crucial vote on that bill was whether you should have 1 or 2 years period of separation, not whether you had fault or no fault. That was never really a serious issue, and it was an interesting debate. It was an important piece of legislation. I think the point I'm making is that some people saw it as a change that would improve circumstances, particularly for women. I think it would have been better if you had a 2-year period, I think, rather than one.
So the crack in the bedrock for you is actually about that separation period?
Yeah, the separation period. It was an interesting debate. There were 6 current or former or future Prime Ministers participated in the debate, and they divided 3 each. Whitlam, McMahon and Gorton voted for the 1 year, and Fraser, Keating and Howard voted for the 2. It was an interesting debate, and the vote on that issue was 60 to 59. And it was just an interesting and very important debate, and of course it being a free vote, and free votes are always fascinating because they liberate people on both sides, and there was certainly a very strong tension inside the Labor Party between its more conservative members and some of those who saw this piece of legislation as a test of the party's modernist virility.
On Iraq, you write that you could see the evidence for invasion and that view hasn't changed. But what effect, if any, did the enormous public opposition have on you at the time as the Prime Minister representing all of those people? Did that in any way have a play in your judgment?
Well, I was very conscious of it, Virginia. I write in the book of my earnest desire to try and secure yet another resolution, not for legal reasons, another resolution from the Security Council, not for legal reasons, but because the Labor Party had indicated that if there were another resolution authorising action, then the Labor Party would support action being taken. And of course, there wasn't another resolution because the Russians and the French were opposed to there being another resolution. If they'd had a different view, then we'd have had a bipartisan position. Of course, it had an impact, but and what I tried to do was to explain and argue the reason why the government had reached the decision it had. I thought it was necessary to do that, and I continued to argue the case very, very strongly, but I was not able to, in advance of the invasion, I was not able to bring the public with me in large numbers according to the opinion polls, although once the decision had been taken and our forces became involved, public support did rise quite sharply, and then over a period of time in subsequent months it drifted down again. So there was an element in which once the decision had been taken, even many people who were opposed to it said, OK, the government's considered all of this, they've taken a decision, we're not sure we agree with them, but we'll go along with it.
Our time is short this morning, so we're going to be bouncing around subjects. I'm sorry about that. I wish I could spend more time with you. But I'm interested in getting into your mindset at around about the time of the decision of the intervention, because there was compelling evidence of child abuse and domestic violence in Indigenous communities long before the Little Children Are Sacred report came out back in 2007. What was it about that time and that report that moved you to act in the Northern Territory?
I suppose some reports are written in a more compelling fashion. They seem to come at a time when patience with those who've got control of events is exhausted. The Territory was responsible for law and order. It's still responsible for law and order. Child protection is fundamental to the maintenance of law and order. And the eloquent and compelling and quite chilling language of that particular report, I guess, was the thing that brought me to that decision. And in Malbrough, I had an Indigenous Affairs Minister who was wholly engaged in this. Not that his predecessors weren't, but he really felt very strongly on this issue. And we were satisfied that significant Indigenous leaders would support it. Some, of course, would strongly oppose it. But I guess we'd given the Northern Territory multiple opportunities to get their own house in order, and they hadn't. And if some more recent reports are to be believed, they still haven't.
The impression
and that is a matter of real concern to the current, or should be a matter of real concern, and I'm sure it is to both the Labor government and also to the opposition leader, Tony Abbott, who's always taken a very deep interest in Indigenous affairs and has spent a lot of personal time in Indigenous communities.
Reading the book, I'm struck by what seems to me as a remarkable lack of self-doubt. You write on how you weren't wrong on how you handled Pauline Hanson, and you don't think you are now in retrospect. Your government wasn't wrong on children overboard. You did nothing wrong in relation to the leadership. I know very few people who are so completely certain. Are you completely immune to self-doubt, John Howard?
No, I'm not. I actually
That's the impression you give in this book.
In the book, I certainly acknowledge a couple of mistakes I made in relation to the leadership issue. I deal with those. I acknowledge in relation to Indigenous affairs, there were some handling errors. What I said in the book, though, was that all of the big decisions I took, I believed in, and I still do. Now,
but do you ever wake up in the middle of the night worrying and doubting and second-guessing your decisions? Or are you a man who makes a decision and that's it?
No, look, I detail in the book extracts from my diary in relation to Iraq about having broken sleep and recording that it all seems to be going in the wrong direction, and how I didn't like for a moment the idea that we would go into Iraq without bipartisan support. I mean, these things were very much in my mind. I worried on the eve of the East Timor intervention that there might be an ambush of an Australian patrol by rogue elements of the Indonesian militia, and that might result in casualties, significant casualties of diggers. So, I mean, all of these things, of course, but if you are a Prime Minister and you've got ultimate responsibility, you give a lot of thought to these big decisions, and you don't take them lightly, but once you've taken them, you have to accept responsibility for them. I don't have a lot of patience with people who years later say, well, look, I got all of that wrong, and, you know, please forget about it and look at this. And I've got to live with the decisions I took. I accept responsibility for them, and nothing I can now say is going to alter them because I'm no longer in office. All I can do is explain to the Australian people the basis on which they were taken, and that's what I've endeavoured to do in this book.
John Howard, let's quickly, if we can, in the last minutes remaining, spool through a couple of issues. Do you see the possibility of a Tea Party-like movement starting up in Australia, and do you think that would be a good or a bad thing?
I don't. We have a different political system from the Americans. One of the reasons why American politics produces an organisation like the Tea Party is that there is a constant debate about some fundamental human rights issues and the like in the United States because people don't feel they can ever make a decision on it. I think America is plagued by being a Bill of Rights society where the courts decide a lot of things that the political process decides in Australia. That's one of the reasons why I was strongly opposed to a Bill of Rights in this country. So many of these contentious social issues in America are constantly kicked back and forth in the courts. Things like abortion, if you like, and so forth. Now, they are matters that should be resolved by the Parliament. They are not as controversial in Australia. It's not because people don't feel strongly about them. They do. It's just that they see a political process whereby decisions are taken and positions are established, whereas that never happens in the United States, and there's an immense sense of frustration within the political process that you can't really get anywhere or achieve any resolution on many of these issues. And I'm not entering a view either way on particular issues. I'm making an observation about the process.
In a party room vote, would you go for Tony Abbott or Malcolm Turnbull?
In a party room vote, oh, I'd support Tony Abbott, but I supported Malcolm Turnbull when he was there. But everybody knows I'm a close friend of Tony Abbott's. But I also have had very good relations with Malcolm. I encouraged him to stay in Parliament, and but then, Virginia, I don't have a party room vote.
I know you don't. Just for this conversation, I'm just handing you one for the morning. I ask you that question just because, and I know, of course, we all know you're a great supporter of Tony Abbott, but I wonder if I'm reading too much between the lines here. The way you've been speaking about Malcolm Turnbull recently is enormously praiseworthy. Are you seeing something different in him or some potential in him that you've not seen before?
No, I always wanted Malcolm to be a big contributor. After the Republican referendum back in 1999...
Yeah, he wasn't too kind about you.
Yeah, well, but I understood it. I mean, he poured his all into that, and you know, you've got to let, in public life, you've got to let a lot of those things go through to the wicket keeper, because we all say things in the heat of the moment. And you've got to look at the take the long view. And I made it very clear that I wanted him to return. I wanted him to return to the Liberal fold. And then when he ran for Wentworth, I certainly didn't try and stop him. I mean, I didn't get involved, as some people have suggested, but I certainly didn't do anything to stop him, and I was very happy to have him in Parliament. And he was a good parliamentary secretary, and he was a good minister. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't still very strongly support Tony Abbott.
Now, also, we're hearing news this morning that the Treasury Chief Ken Henry is tipped to retire sometime soon, perhaps even before the next budget. What's your assessment of him?
Oh, Ken Henry was a good Treasury Secretary. I worked with him closely. He did a very good technical job with Peter Costello. And Peter Costello was, obviously handled both the economics and the politics of building the detail of the GST. But I was impressed with the work that Ken Henry did on the GST. He was not then Secretary, Ted Evans was, but Ken was in charge of the task group that was putting together the detail. And it was a massive job. And what I say in the book is that it was a remarkable thing that Peter Costello and his Treasury team had put together a GST that didn't seem to have any cracks in it. We got through that very difficult 1998 election campaign, living in fear all the time that we'd be caught out on a technical detail, but we got through it, and a lot of the credit for that is due to the Treasury team, obviously working with the then Treasurer.
Good to talk to you again, John Howard. Thanks so much.
Thank you.